I'm delighted to be joined by Sinclair McKay here at the Chalk Valley History Festival, talking about Berlin, a city shaped by life and loss. I wanted to start off by asking, why did you decide to write about Berlin?
Because Berlin is a city that kind of stood at the very centre of the 20th century. In a weird way, you can't really understand the 20th century without understanding Berlin. Not just the fall of Berlin in 1945 or the rise of the Nazis that came before that, but in terms of art, architecture, in terms of film, the development of film as an art form, in music. It just seems the most extraordinarily focused kind of point of so many geopolitical anxieties, up to and including the Cold War and beyond.
Of course, after the First World War, Germany was on the brink of revolution.
Yes, and the streets were ricocheting with bullets, and this was in the aftermath of the war, where there had been so much death, so much slaughter, and then to have a revolution, basically, in the streets. But ordinary Berliners were just trying to get on with their lives at the same time, trying to rebuild their lives at the same time. And this is, in essence, something you see in ordinary Berliners all the way through the decades of the 20th century, up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. Revolutions are happening all around them. Their lives are being torn this way and that, and all they want to do is just get on with life.
And of course, Weimar was a great cosmopolitan society, the 1920s, the Jazz Age. They really bought into it. How did it all go so badly wrong?
Well, it's extraordinary that it should have. There was a brilliant writer whose name now entirely escapes me, even though it shouldn't. He's at the start of chapter 4. Victor Klemperer, the academic, yes. Victor Klemperer, the academic, who was actually Dresden-based and survived that terrible firebombing in 1945. But Victor Klemperer looked at Nazi Berlin and said, how did that ever happen in Berlin? Because he understood Berlin to be, as you say, it's a very cosmopolitan, very kind of open, but also just filled with a kind of very rough wit and laughter too. All the things that were just kind of completely anti the ethos of the Nazis. In fairness to the Berliners, it was never really Hitler's city. Hitler never cared for Berlin. Albert Speer never did. He wanted to knock it down. Goebbels the same. He called it asphalt monster. They were much happier in Munich, Nuremberg. Berlin was never theirs.
And of course, Albert Speer, they had all these grand plans, these unbelievable kind of ideas for how to reformat the city. Why did it never actually come to fruition?
It was he and Hitler had scale models in the upper rooms of the Reichschancellery of the city that Speer was envisaging, the city they were going to build, which Hitler had kind of specified as certain things. And you look at it now, this enormous dome of the People's Hall that was planned. It would be sort of 17 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral. It never happened simply because they decided to go to war with the continent and the world instead. But on top of that, the irony is that if they had tried to build the Great People's Dome, it would have sunk within weeks because of Berlin's sandy soil. So this is the essence of Albert Speer, the architect. There's dull neoclassical kind of ideas merged with often great impracticality.
And moving on to, of course, the filmmaking, Goebbels was very keen on kind of the films and the propaganda value, and they made these unbelievable films, rom-coms, epics, including one called Munchausen?
Yes, indeed, Baron von Munchausen, which it's still available on DVD, actually. It's one of those rare films where, even though it came out of the Nazi regime, and even though it was commissioned directly by the Nazi regime, it doesn't appear to be inflected by Nazi ideology. It's the most extraordinary film to watch now, the full Technicolor, based on the adventures of Baron von Munchausen, the famous liar. So it's an incredibly rich fantasy, but it's a fantasy that seems to run counter to the triumphalism of Nazism, and that's because the screenwriter was Erich Kästner, a Berliner novelist who was most famous for Emil and the Detectives, but who was also a chronicler of Berlin's social evils long before the Nazis turned up, and then an opponent of the Nazis, and yet he was still commissioned to write this book. So there are kind of moments, even the Goebbels tried to commandeer cinema for the Nazis, but it could never be theirs, because it's just like music and art and architecture. They tried to impose an ideology and it just couldn't last.
And a final question, you've had a very busy day already, you've already delivered 2 talks. What are you looking forward to seeing this afternoon at the festival?
Oh, there's so much to choose from, as ever, with the Chalk Valley Festival. You could run around like a kid in a sweet shop, just from point to point. And that's what makes it actually my favourite festival of the lot. Everything, since I've hated Cheltenham, but actually it's Chalk Valley that's really got it, because apart from anything else, you also get the best best people coming to Talk Valley, in terms of audiences who really know what they're talking about. The question and answer sessions you get at Talk Valley are the best of the lot, because there are people who just know so much about the subjects, very often much more than I ever would. And the discussions that come out of that, and the stuff that, even today, the stuff that I've come away and learned. What East Berlin smelt like in the 1970s. Chinese code breaking in the 14th century. Areas that I need to go away and now start to read up on.
That's fantastic. Sinclair, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you.
Thank you.